As entrepreneurs, we all have a reason why we chose to leave our 9 to 5 for an 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I'm here to capture those stories of why we all hustle and grind for our companies. Dan is a lawyer at Dickinson Wright PLLC, where he helps his clients navigate the legal side so they can thrive in growing their businesses. He formerly worked as an accountant and passed the CPA exam. He is the author of the book The Chief Justices and a frequent speaker and writer. He is the trustee advisor for his clients. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really, really appreciate it. You are in a topic that I just nerd out to and I love. So I guess the first thing I'd love to do, tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your ninja skill?
Sure. My ninja skill is being able to juggle a bunch of different swords, I guess, at the same time. And the reason I say that is my career. If anybody looks at it, is probably one of the more eclectic out there. I actually have two professions. I started out as I passed the CPA exam. I never practiced in public accounting, so I'm not a CPA, but I passed the CPA exam successfully in 1989. I worked for 5.5 years at a large publicly traded insurance company, the last 3 years in investment accounting, and then moved up to a role as a paralegal. When I graduated law school, I was a trial lawyer and did a lot of different things in that arena. Then I went in-house for 13.5 years, did a lot of corporate, transactional, M&A, regulatory compliance, and privacy and cyber. Then went back into private practice where I helped clients, including small entrepreneurs like your listeners. Then I went back in-house to try to take a company public for 2.5 years, and then been back in law firms for 9 years, and have done just a broad, probably swath of things, including I serve as an arbitrator in various matters as well. And so just bring that kind of eclectic in-house, outside lawyer business acumen to the table. And those are the swords that I'm talking about, as a ninja, juggling and being able to not cut myself.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as entrepreneurs, we know what that is, where your job title is yes, all the things. Yeah.
Right? Bottle wash and everything, right? Yep.
Well, exactly. But no, from the standpoint of like clients are concerned, there one of the things that we all get into as entrepreneurs is we have like this person over here, this person over here, this person over here. We got this sort of team that we have, whereas you're trying to fill a lot of those roles together. So like with having that expertise in being a CPA, having the expertise in the legal end of things is too, which I think is an interesting mix, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I have a team, a large team of lawyers in Dickinson Wright that I'm at.
Yeah.
But I try to consider myself kind of a general advisor, and I do a segment for a radio show twice a month it's named the Trusted Advisor. I try to be that, and more, not just on legal stuff, but to be like a kind of a concierge. So when people come and say, "Hey, do you have a plumber? Do you have somebody who works in the public school system, or do you have somebody that can help me in this arena?" And try to be kind of that person like you're talking about that brings together these teams of trusted advisors, whether it's accountants, tax, law, and try to weave and oversee that with my kind of broad swath that we just talked about.
Mhm. Now, how did you get into this? Like, so that's part of why, the podcast is around. I like to hear the origin stories of how you got to this place. Besides the education, like what was there something in you that said, I really want to be a CPA, or I really want to be a lawyer? Was there some sort of defining moment that got you to that point?
Sure, there's two defining moments. The first is in high school. I went to Gordon Tech High School in Chicago, a
Mhm.
large Catholic school at the time. I had about 2,700 all boys. And I took an accounting class my senior year with the baseball coach, Red Miller. He was also maybe a CPA. I don't even know if he was a CPA, but he was like the accounting whisperer. He was one of those people that whatever the topic was, he could have taught it to you and you would have loved it. And when I look back, some of my classmates, my football teammates, but also just my graduates in the class of 700, there were 25 people maybe in that class, and I can count at least a dozen of my friends and people I know from that took that class that are now CPAs and practicing accounting. And so that was what triggered that. I just fell in love with it, and then I went to college. There was a great professor or professors that taught me accounting, and that was just kind of what I wanted to do. the legal thing came from my football, and I had a postgraduate scholarship, like we just talked about. I passed the CPA exam. I was doing accounting, and I felt like I knew the business world. I told my wife, maybe I'm going to challenge myself and try to audit a class at law school. All the law schools came back and said you can't do that. You got to take the standardized test. And I took it. I did well, and then I applied to a couple schools that had night programs and that started in January because that's when the scholarship expired, and fell in love with law and just the idea of I went to a small liberal arts school undergrad, and I consider law to be kind of a master's of liberal arts because it's a lot of critical thinking and kind of making connections and being able to write and speak, and let people know, bring it down to a personal level.
Mhm. Interesting. It's interesting how now how specifically did so it's sort of an interesting. Sorry, I'm just trying to kind of correlate these two. So now, when you got the CPA, you got the law degree. Um, what were you in the corporate world before then, or were you something like was this something you went in, and then what was that moment when you said, "All right, I'm ready to go on my own"? Like what precipitated that?
Sure. Like I said, I had a long and kind of circuitous route, and I've been called a transient by some folks at times. I uh I started out in the corporate world. I worked at a large publicly traded insurance company in Chicago. Like I said, I was in a rotational program for 2 years in the accounting program, and then went into investment accounting. Was going to law school while I was doing that. So then my last year I was a paralegal. When I graduated, I went out to a law firm and was there for about 2 years litigating. Was happy. I got a call back from that company saying, "Hey, we'd like you back in a non-litigation role." And so I went and ended up for 13 and a half years in-house. And then one of my friends from that first law firm said, "Hey, you should really jump over the wall and come into private practice with all your connections and all the stuff you have in the industry." And so I did. And then, long story on that, he had some issues. He was doing a lot of work for one client in Bermuda. They said, "Whoa, you can't do that because of this kind of tax issues." And so it became apparent that at that firm it was going to be very difficult. And so I went out on my own, joined with a few other people that I knew from bar association activities, and so was there for about 2.5 years, and had fun and really built up the business. But like all of your listeners, same issues, right? I was everything. I was technology. I was the kind of rental agent. I was, billing coordinator, and
Uh,
uh, and so faced all those challenges. And again, that was a good experience for me because it's brought to bear on my current situation, able to talk to these small to mid-sized to growing companies about the same challenges.
mhm. Now, you said one of the things you kind of specialize in, one of the things that you do is corporate structure. And so this is something that when we started off, I said this is something I nerd out to because I feel it's very, very important. The corporate structure isn't just about LLCs. There's way more to it. And so can you go a little bit more about corporate structures, specifically like Nevada and Wyoming and that sort of a thing, and how they're used, and especially like Delaware, because I think that's one that people here, but may not understand exactly where the benefits are specifically with like Delaware and Nevada. I think now it's Wyoming and Montana have now followed suit, if I'm right. But yeah.
That's correct. And so Delaware's been kind of the main place, especially for corporations. If you're a C corp or an S corporation, the benefits of Delaware is that the Chancery Court there has been doing this for many years. It's very consistent, although there's been some changes in recent years. There's a lot of confidentiality, I would say, at Delaware. And so Delaware's kind of got this robust law that favors corporations and corporate identities. When it comes to LLCs and things, it's not as developed a law. There are some things that are just kind of not as developed because most people, if you look at publicly traded companies for sure, they usually pick Delaware, right? Not It's changed some, but if you look at most SEC filings, you'll see that Delaware is the domicile. Um, and so you mentioned Nevada. One of the advantages of Nevada is again secrecy, very good dynasty laws on trusts and estates, the 365-year dynasty trust that they have. established in Nevada that's been attractive. I think that's driving a lot of the corporate structure that you geek out on is that these states, Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, they've come up with these kind of trust laws that are very favorable to folks, that you can protect assets, kind of figure out succession planning without being overly taxed. And this is going to be more and more important, I think, as we get into 2025 when the cliff goes down on the estates. Um, so we had talked before we started the show briefly. Two main reasons people go to a particular state. One is the body of law, so Delaware's right, or three. Second is secrecy of who the owners are, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the third is taxation. So in states like Montana and Wyoming, Nevada, there's no state property taxes. Florida as well, and so that's been a choice. But as we talked about, one of the challenges is in the conversation I like to have with clients about what form of entity, where they want to go, is where is your business taking place? If you live in Chicago, Illinois, and you're incorporating into Montana for the reason that you don't get taxed at the state property state level, but yet you work in Illinois, all your stuff is done in Illinois, you're gonna have to file a tax return for all that income. And if you've got, like, say, it's real estate property management, the reality is that the situs of that actual activity is in Illinois. And believe it or not, the revenue departments of a particular state, if something happens, if there's a transfer, they're going to be interested. You also, in that case, will have to file a foreign registration with the state of Illinois to have rights to go to court and other rights. And so it gets kind of questionable. And then the thing that I think listeners should be aware of as well, Andrew, is the Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act a few years ago. It became effective in 2024. If you're a new entity forming in any state in the United States nowadays, you have to, with some exceptions, if you're a charity and some other things, you have to file what's known as a beneficial ownership interest (BOI) report with FinCEN, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Treasury, within 90 days of forming. If you're a new corporation or LLC or trust, if you're in existence by year end, you'll have to report. And so some of the transparency reasons that we talked about may go away, but stay tuned because there's a lot of developments right now taking place with the Supreme Court and some of its Chevron and other doctrines that it's reviewing with the end of term. And so there's challenges to the CTA Act. And so listeners should stay tuned about whether or not that will actually see the light of day and actually be fully rolled out.
Mm-hmm. It's one of those situations. File anyway, because the penalties are huge on FinCEN violations, but
Right.
It may just be for nothing,
Right. It's $500 a day, which is, it can add up, 365 days if you don't do it, and you start getting those notices plus penalties. You're talking some serious coin.
Exactly. So, so going into kind of some of the, so we went into the corporate structures and that. You also specialize in cybersecurity, and I think this is something that's not talked about very much. And as entrepreneurs, I mean, I know a lot of folks with like the same password on everything, we're not used to that. And unless you're working in a regulated industry where you have to start, banking or some other thing like that, where we have to start thinking about it and we're really regulated heavily on it. What are your thoughts on cybersecurity and to the average entrepreneur? Like I do keynotes. I mean, it's not like I do anything that's going to be, hugely, it might be confidential to my clients, but they're not really anything big. And while I have cybersecurity in place, what are your thoughts to somebody like me who isn't in finance, isn't in real estate, doesn't have large transactions, as far as cybersecurity? What should we think?
Yeah. I think for someone like you, the risk is low. You probably might get social security numbers or any kind of other data. You may probably third party out your payment systems. I'm just guessing, but if you have that internally, those are things you need to be worried about because again, credit cards are valuable, right? For at least a one shot. We all get those notices. Did you authorize a transaction in Portland, Oregon? No, I wasn't there. Like, hard copy was shown. Like, okay, I doubt it. But for many of us, again, we're on the internet. I think that the biggest rule that I always talk to people about is upfront. Try to be proactive. Take a look at the data you're collecting and ask yourself, why are you collecting it? Like, there's a lot of things like, I'll go on like Major League Baseball or, register here to win 2 free tickets to the All-Star game or whatever. And then it'll ask what my date of birth is, including year.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they need to know that, right?
Yeah.
If I'm over 21. I get it with like if it's liquor, but ask yourself why you're collecting the data and then how you're reporting the collection and usage of data, because the Federal Trade Commission, at least right now, is still very aggressive in the arena of finding people in non-compliance with Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, which is also the Non-Compete Act, what the authority they're using. And again, we'll see what happens with the FTC, but that's what I tell people is we have to start at that. What data are you collecting? Where are you storing it? Why are you collecting it? Does it have value? Because if not, the chance of attack and you now being subject to ransomware or your client's information getting out, reputational damage, risk of loss of relationships, and other serious loss. There's that CDK breach out in the auto dealer where people can't make reservations, auto dealers. That's a huge breach. And so again, understand the data you're collecting and take steps to make sure that, like you said, don't use the same passwords. And the other thing is that you're only as strong as your weakest link. You have to train all the third parties and all of your employees, all of your workers, independent contractors. Don't click on the thing that looks like it's FedEx. If you're not expecting something from FedEx or the United States Post Office, if you don't expect something from your credit card and you get something that says, hey, we just charged you if call this number. If you get a text like that, look on the back of your credit card, look on your bank statements, look on your actual documentation and call that number, because what's happening now is there's a lot of spoofing and real deep fakes in terms of even voice. And so my advice is always be vigilant and make sure you've got a good internal system for how you're collecting, storing, and using this data.
Mm-hmm. And talking about data, one of the questions that kind of came up with me recently, and it's something that in a project that I'm working on, and I think it's something that's really interesting, is GDPR. I think here in the States, we think that doesn't apply to us because that's a European regulation. And so I think go into a little bit about GDPR and how it can apply to us here in the States.
So yeah, GDPR is the European Union's privacy regime. It followed the privacy Regulation 95 that was in place in 1995 when I first started in the arena of privacy and cyber. And it's pretty restrictive, and it applies to EU subjects, which is people that have national attachments to any of the EU 37 countries, I think it is still. It's pretty onerous. It's got a lot of more extreme things than almost anything except for California's act. And how does it apply? We're all international now. And so, and a lot of people, even if they may be European, they could use a .com email. Our neighbors to the north, even though .ca is the Canadian extension. When I worked at a place, my last in-house gig, we talked about, they had a lot of customers from Canada applying or getting emails, and those people would say, we're subject to Canadian privacy laws, and so you violated them. So that's how it applies. And furthermore, many of us use overseas technology storages. Facebook for a long time was over in Ireland. Is their kind of headquarters or data collections. So again, if you're using third parties as an entrepreneur, if your cloud may be over there, if that's the case, then again, you've got some concerns about storage and data usage. And one of the things that's happened is the U.S. is tried to figure out ways to be on an equivalent path or plate with the EU. Those have been stricken down several times, and so there's now in effect or place or attempts to again have a third version of it. And again, we'll see. There's a guy, Max Schrems, who's been very good about suing Facebook and Meta, and has won twice. Has caused the collapse of these regimes. So we'll see if he challenges whatever the new thing is. And so yeah, And again, if you're doing business in the United States, if you're on the internet, then you got to start thinking about the EU. You've got to think about California, Colorado, Virginia, Utah, and more states are passing privacy laws that are somewhat equivalent to GDPR, but nothing's quite as extreme as GDPR.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've noticed is specifically, I have a friend of mine that owns a company and it only operates in the US. That's it. Just there's a lot of reasons behind why it can't operate elsewhere, but and that's one of the questions they had is do we still do we still have to comply with GDPR even though if we
And
only operate in the US?
if you only operate in the US and you're not taking customers from overseas, then what I recommend is you put on your privacy statements that you're not subject to GDPR, right? And leave it at that. And again, I think someone would be hard pressed to say somehow you're subject to that, right? If they're not selling, they're not doing business with anybody in Europe, then they're not getting data. They're probably rejecting it up front. And so I think those are easy questions. Although I've had in the past, I had a lady, she was from the U.S. She taught music, and then she went to Paris part of the year. I had another guy that was like an artist, and he went between, I think it was the same, Paris and the East Coast of the United States. And he was concerned. He was, that both of them were saying, well, my rights have been violated. And I would say, what data are you talking about? Because if it's when you're over in EU, then maybe you've got a case. If you're in the U.S., just because you're a European citizen, but you're in the U.S. getting sales, probably not the same, right? It's where you're located at the time. So
Yeah. No, that's a big thing, and GDPR does have a lot of teeth if you're operating in Europe. So I figured I wanted to ask about it because it's just kind of some stuff that came into my life. I was like asking questions like this when I get an expert. Let's ask
yeah.
ask a
The other
question on what's going on, right?
the other thing I would point out on the EU is they've come up with the first artificial intelligence regulations framework. Just recently, it passed in May or June, maybe the final.
Mm.
And again, it has things about like scrubbing and artificial intelligence for the original applications and stuff because of perceived or maybe actual biases that are built into these systems. And so they've got rules on what different levels of what AI can be used. And again, that's probably going to get imported over here as we struggle with AI. So stay tuned on that as well.
Yeah, getting used to this new technology is a powerful tool, but it's also, there needs to be some sort of check and balance on it. So absolutely. Well, we're getting to the end of things. I do have one question for you. I ask this of every single person I have on the podcast, and that is, what is one book or podcast you have listened to or read that has had a significant impact on your life?
Paul, that's a good question.
Yeah, either recently or like in the past, or hey, I just read this great book recently. I leave it a little open so that way you can kind of
I read a lot of books. I just read a novel that's called Southern Man, and given the debates last week, and given kind of where the country's at, it's really it's a 950 something page novel. It's about a third party candidate that's going to run for president, and he's doing a lot of he's a former military special agent type guy. And so he's, doing. It turns out maybe he's doing some bad things, and it's just really makes me think. And that guy's got the pulse. I don't know if that's the most influential book I've ever read. I'm trying to think about that, and one book that again as an accounting geek and lawyer geek that really I enjoyed was Graham. I'm trying to think of his first name. He was kind of the mentor to Warren Buffett. He's got a book about reading financial statements that's very concise from the 1920s or 30s. That's the best book I've ever read on accounting principles. And when I used to teach accounting for lawyers, I'd recommend that book. When I teach about accounting, I recommend that book. And what was the second part of that? Or
So it was just either whether it was a book or a podcast.
Okay.
So I'll give you a choice of which one it is.
Yeah.
Yep. Interesting. And it's interesting to me. I took accounting in college, and it was as part of a business degree. And it was interesting to me. Accounting hasn't changed a whole lot. It's been around about 400 years, and it hasn't changed much.
Yeah, or more. It was right around the time of Columbus. Pascali came up with it, and it's still most of the rules, the double entry bookkeeping. It's amazing back then that he came up with this system that still I guess works.
Even back then, they were trying to deal with journal entries and how to handle it.
Non-balancing books. What?
Exactly. All righty. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate your wisdom here.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us on the Hustle and Grind podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Dan, check out the link in the description.